Good evening and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. There's no rush tonight. Nothing to solve, nothing to remember, nowhere at all that you need to be. Wherever you are right now, curled beneath a blanket, sinking into a pillow, resting in the dark with your eyes already growing heavy, you're exactly where you're meant to be. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the day, with all its noise and hurry, begin to loosen and drift away behind you. Tonight, we're going to travel to a world that is nearer to us in time than most, and yet, in so many quiet ways, utterly different. A world of gaslight and coal smoke, of horse-drawn cabs clattering over wet cobbles, of great grimy cities roaring with new machines, and of green country lanes where almost nothing had changed in 100 years. A world of vast fortunes and terrible poverty, often living side by side on the very same street. A world of tall chimneys and taller top hats, of railways stitching the whole land together for the first time, of the parlor fire and the kitchen range and the long, formal, candlelit dinner. The world of the Victorians. And I promise you, this isn't going to be a story of kings and battles and dates to remember. There'll be no dry lists of prime ministers tonight, no dusty parade of treaties and reforms. We're going to do something far gentler than that, and I think far more surprising. We're going to step down off the grand stage of history and into the kitchens. We're going to look into their pots and their pantries and their teacups. We're going to find out what these people actually ate, every ordinary day, in every kind of home, from the poorest family crowded into a single smoky room, all the way up to the great lady dining beneath the glittering chandeliers of a country house. Because whatever else the Victorians did, and they did a great deal, remaking the whole modern world in the space of a single long reign, they were, first and last, people who had to eat. Every single day, the factory hand and the duchess, the crossing sweeper and the queen herself. They rose in the cold and the dark. They lit their fires and set their kettles. They shopped and cooked and scrimped and served. They sat down when they could to whatever their purse and their place allowed. And the story of how they did it, of what filled the plate and the bowl and the cup across those long, changing years, turns out to be one of the warmest, homeliest, most deeply human stories you could ever hope to hear. So settle in, get comfortable, pull the covers up a little higher if you like. There's nothing here you need to hold on to, and nothing you need to do. If your mind wanders, let it wander. If your eyes close, let them close. My voice will simply keep going, soft and low, carrying you along, like the gentle rocking of a railway carriage on a long and quiet evening journey. We're going to gather up 100 small facts tonight, 100 little glimpses into the food and the drink of the Victorian world in the long years of the 19th century. How they fed the great new cities that had swollen up almost overnight. How the railways changed forever what a family could put on its table. What the rich ate at their endless, astonishing dinners, and what the poor scraped together in the hungry corners of the same great country. How tea rose to become the very heart of the home. What new inventions, the tin, the range, the refrigerated ship, quietly transformed the everyday meal. And again, what a single dish could softly say about who a person was and where they stood in the vast and crowded web of Victorian society. Because for these people, just as for so many others across the long span of history, food was never only food. It was survival, yes, but it was also respectability and comfort and class and love. It was the mark of a well-run household. It was the warm heart of a family gathered at the end of a long day. It was the anxious question hanging over a poor mother counting her few coins. It was the glittering theatre of a great dinner where reputations were made and matches were arranged. It was the cup of tea that mended a quarrel and the Christmas pudding carried in flaming to a roomful of cheers. So let's begin, not in a palace and not in a slum, but somewhere warm and ordinary and in between. In a modest terraced house, on an ordinary evening, with the fire glowing in the black iron range and the good smell of supper rising into the little kitchen. Let's step inside and warm ourselves and see what there is to eat. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing in such a kitchen. It's evening, and outside the gaslight is just coming on, casting its soft yellow pools along the darkening street, and a fine cold rain is beginning to fall. But in here, it's warm. The range, that great black iron beast that is the beating heart of the whole house, has been kept burning all day, and the kettle is singing gently upon it, and something is cooking slow and savory in a pot. The room is small and close, and full of the smells of cooking and coal and washing and life. There is a scrubbed wooden table in the middle, and a dresser against the wall stacked with the family's plates and cups, and a clothes horse steaming faintly by the fire. This is the everyday world of the Victorians, not the grand drawing rooms of the history books, but the kitchen and the parlor and the pantry, where the real business of feeding a family went on, day after day, year after year. And it was a world changing, faster than any that had come before it. Within a single lifetime, the whole way that ordinary people ate was being turned upside down, by the railway, by the factory, by the great new shops, by foods arriving from the far corners of a growing empire. Someone born at the start of the Victorian Age, and dying at its end, would have seen the food on the family table transformed almost beyond recognition. Let's look now into the pot, because in this house, as in most Victorian houses, there is very often a pot, and very often in it, some form of the great foundation of the age. Fact 1. The single most important food for the great mass of ordinary Victorians was bread. Bread was the true staff of life, the thing that filled the belly and stretched the meager wages, the thing that stood between a poor family and hunger. For the laboring poor, bread might make up the greater part of everything they ate, great quantities of it, day after day, with whatever small savory thing could be found to go alongside. When a poor family's fortunes rose or fell, it very often showed first, and most plainly, in the amount and the quality of the bread upon the table. Fact 2. And the bread of the poor was, for much of the age, a source of real anxiety and even danger, because it was so often adulterated, tampered with by dishonest bakers and millers to increase their profits. White flour, prized and expensive, was cut with cheaper things, with ground-up alum, with chalk, with bean flour and worse. A poor family, paying good money for a loaf, might be eating bread bulked out with substances that did them real harm. The purity of the daily bread was one of the great scandals of the early Victorian table. Fact 3. This adulteration, in fact, ran right through the food of the age, and it went far beyond bread alone. Milk was watered down and sometimes whitened with chalk. Tea leaves were mixed with dried leaves of other plants, or with leaves already used and dried again. Pickles were colored a brighter green with copper. Sweets were tinted with poisonous dyes. In the crowded, unregulated markets of the early Victorian city, the poor in particular could rarely be sure that what they bought was truly what it seemed, and the slow, hard fight to clean up the nation's food was one of the great, quiet struggles of the age. Fact 4. White bread all through the age carried a powerful meaning of status and respectability. The whiter and finer the loaf, the more it was prized and the more it cost. Coarse brown bread was the mark of poverty and the countryside. Soft white bread was the aspiration of the rising family. It seems strange to us now, who often pay more for the brown, but to the Victorians, the gleaming white loaf was a small daily emblem of having got on in the world, of respectability achieved and hunger held at bay. Fact 5. Alongside the bread, for those who could afford it, there was very often that most beloved of Victorian foods, cheese. A good hunk of cheese with bread, and perhaps a raw onion or a pickle, was the classic meal of the working man, the ploughman's fare, portable and filling and cheap. The great cheeses of the English counties, the Cheddar and the Cheshire and the Stilton and the rest, were eaten in enormous quantities, and a wedge of cheese did an enormous amount of quiet work in keeping the ordinary people of the age fed and going. Fact 6. And to spread upon the bread, when it could be had, there was butter, or more often for the poor, its cheaper substitutes. Butter was loved, but costly, and as the century wore on, cleverer and cheaper alternatives began to appear. A new spread, made from beef, fat, and milk, was invented in these years, and would in time become the margarine we know, a cheap substitute for butter that let poorer families have something, at least, to make the dry bread go down more easily. For many, though, the humblest spread of all was simply dripping, the savory fat left over from roasting meat, saved carefully and spread thick on bread, a real and much-loved treat. Fact 7. For the very poorest in the hungriest times, the meal might be little more than bread and a hot drink, bread soaked in weak tea or in hot water with a little milk and sugar if it could be got. There is a whole vanished world of these thin, sad, ingenious meals of poverty. Bread and dripping, bread and scrape, sops of bread in broth or tea, ways of making a very little food fill an empty stomach and warm a cold body. Behind the grand image of Victorian plenty, this quieter, hungrier table was set in a great many homes, far more than the age liked to admit. Now let's turn to the drink that came, more than any other single thing, to define the Victorian home, the warm, brown, comforting heart of it all. Fact 8. Tea. If any one thing sat at the very center of the Victorian table, high and low, rich and poor, it was tea. Over the course of the age, tea went from being a costly luxury to being the essential daily drink of very nearly everyone in the land. Heart cheering, warming, and crucially made with boiled water, which made it safer than much of what came from the tap or the pump, tea became the great comfort and the great ritual of the whole nation. From the grand drawing room to the poorest kitchen, the kettle sang, and the pot was warmed, and the tea was poured. Fact 9. Tea was so beloved and so central that it worked its way right into the shape of the Victorian day and the very names of the meals. For the working family, tea became not just a drink but a whole meal, the substantial evening meal taken when the day's work was done, built around a big pot of tea, and whatever savory food could be set beside it. To this day, in many parts of Britain, the evening meal is still simply called tea, and that homely word carries within it the whole warm history of the Victorian working family gathering at day's end around the teapot. Fact 10. Among the wealthier classes, meanwhile, tea gave rise to one of the most charming and enduring of all Victorian customs, afternoon tea. The story goes that it was invented by a duchess who found herself hungry in the long gap between a light lunch and a very late dinner, and took to having tea and a little something brought to her in the afternoon. Whatever its true origin, afternoon tea, with its delicate cups, its thin bread and butter, its little cakes and sandwiches, its air of gentle refinement, became a cherished ritual of polite society, a small oasis of calm and elegance in the middle of the day. Fact 11. And tea brought with it a whole glittering world of special things: the teapot and the tea service, the sugar bowl and the milk jug, the tea caddy where the precious leaves were kept, often under lock and key, for tea was valuable enough to steal. The making and pouring of tea became an art and a ritual, hedged about with etiquette and performed with real ceremony. To pour tea gracefully for one's guests was a genuine social accomplishment, and the tea table became one of the great stages on which Victorian domestic life was quietly performed. Fact 12. To sweeten the tea, and to sweeten so much else besides, there was sugar, and the Victorians consumed it in ever-growing, astonishing quantities. As the century wore on and the price of sugar fell, it poured into the national diet as never before, into the tea and the jam and the cakes and the puddings and the sweets. This great rising tide of sugar was one of the most profound changes in the whole history of how these islands ate, a flood of sweetness that would have seemed unimaginable to their grandparents, and whose consequences, good and ill, we live with still. Fact 13. Sugar's great companion was jam, for the two together worked a small, quiet revolution on the table of the poor. Cheap sugar made it possible at last for ordinary families to preserve fruit as sweet jam, and to buy it cheaply besides. Bread and jam became a staple treat of the poorer household, especially for children, a way of getting a little cheap sweetness and a little cheap fruit into the diet, and of making the endless bread a good deal more appealing. That humble slice of bread and jam is one of the true tastes of the Victorian childhood. Now let's think about meat, because meat, and above all the amount of it a family could afford, was one of the great dividing lines of the whole Victorian world. Fact 14. How much meat you ate, and how often, said almost everything about where you stood in Victorian society. For the comfortable classes, meat was the center of every main meal, great roasts and joints, chops and steaks, in quantities that astonish us today. For the poor, meat was a rare and precious thing, eaten in small amounts if at all, saved for Sunday if the week had gone well. The gulf between the meat-rich table of the prosperous and the near-meatless table of the poor was one of the widest and most telling gulfs in all of Victorian life. Fact 15. The great Victorian ideal, the very emblem of the well-fed nation, was roast beef. The roast joint of beef, with its Yorkshire pudding, its rich gravy, its air of solid, hearty, prosperous plenty, stood as a kind of national symbol, the food of the strong, well-fed, respectable Englishman. To be able to set a good joint of beef upon the table was, for the rising family, a mark of real success, and the Sunday roast became the great weekly ceremony of the comfortable Victorian home. Fact 16. The Sunday roast, in fact, came with its own clever economy that shaped the whole week's eating in countless homes. The joint was roasted on Sunday and eaten hot. Then its remains appeared cold on Monday, and its final scraps were minced or made into rissoles, or into that great Victorian standby, the shepherd's pie or cottage pie, later in the week. A single joint was stretched, with real ingenuity, across many days, for even in comfortable homes, waste was frowned upon, and making the food go round was a genuine domestic skill. Fact 17. For the poor, the most important meat by far, when there was any, was bacon. A little bacon went a very long way. A few rashers could flavor a whole pot of vegetables or a pan of potatoes, lending their precious savor and fat to an otherwise plain and meatless meal. A side of bacon hanging in the cottage, or even a small piece kept for the pot, was a real treasure, doled out carefully to bring a taste of meat to the family's food without ever quite being a meal of meat itself. Fact 18. Offal, the cheaper inner parts of the animal, fed a great many Victorian families who could never have afforded the prime cuts. Liver, kidneys, tripe, hearts, trotters, chitlins, and all the rest were cheap, nourishing, and widely eaten, especially by the urban poor. Whole shops and market stalls specialized in these cheaper meats, and dishes made from them, faggots, tripe and onions and the like, were the honest, everyday meat food of the working towns. Fact 19. And then there were the pies, those great portable meat pies and pastries that fed the working city on the move. The pie shop and the pie seller were everywhere, offering hot meat pies, eel pies, pork pies, and pasties to hungry workers who had no time and no place to cook. The pie was the fast food of the Victorian age, warming and filling and easily carried, and it fed the vast laboring crowds of the great cities as they hurried about the endless business of the new industrial world. Now let's go down to the water, because fish, in these years, underwent one of the greatest transformations of all, and rose from a limited food to feed the whole hungry nation. Fact 20. For much of history, fresh sea fish had been a food only for those who lived near the coast, for it spoiled so quickly that it could not travel far inland before it turned. But the coming of the railways changed everything. Suddenly, fish could be packed in ice and carried, fast from the fishing ports deep into the heart of the country, reaching the great inland cities fresh enough to eat. The railway, more than anything, brought the fish of the sea to the tables of the landlocked poor for the very first time. Fact 21. And out of this new abundance of cheap railway-borne fish, together with the cheap fried potato, came one of the most beloved foods these islands have ever known: fish and chips. Rising up in the poorer districts of the industrial towns in the latter part of the age, the fish and chip shop offered a hot, filling, tasty, and above all cheap meal to the working masses: fish fried in batter and potatoes cut into chips and fried in fat, wrapped up in paper and eaten piping hot. It became the great popular meal of working Britain, and it remains, to this day, one of the truest and best-loved tastes of the nation. Fact 22. Among the poor of the great cities, and above all in London, there was another humble fish that fed the multitudes: the oyster. Strange as it seems to us now, when oysters are a luxury, in Victorian times they were so plentiful and so cheap that they were the food of the poor, piled high on street stalls, sold by the barrel, eaten by the dozen by working people. Oysters went into pies and stews to stretch the meat, and were swallowed raw from the shell as a cheap and cheerful snack. Only later, as the great oyster beds were fished out, did they climb slowly up the social ladder to become the delicacy we know. Fact 23. Shellfish of all kinds, cockles, mussels, whelks, winkles, shrimps, were sold from stalls and barrows in the poorer streets and at the seaside, eaten with a pin and a sprinkle of vinegar as a cheap treat. The cry of the shellfish seller was one of the familiar sounds of the Victorian street, and a saucer of winkles or cockles was one of the small, affordable pleasures of the working people, a little taste of the sea brought right to the smoky heart of the town. Fact 24. Herring, that great silvery multitude of the northern seas, remained a vital food for the poor throughout the age. Cheap, oily, and nourishing, herring was eaten fresh where it could be got, and preserved in vast quantities by salting and smoking. The kipper, the herring split, salted, and smoked, became a beloved breakfast dish, and the bloater and the red herring fed countless families who could afford little else in the way of fish or meat. The humble herring did an enormous amount to keep the poorer people of the age fed. Now let's turn to the great foundation of the poor Victorian's plate, the humble root that so very often stood in for everything else: the potato. Fact 25. The potato, by Victorian times, had become one of the most important foods of the poor across these islands: cheap, filling, easy to grow, and nourishing. A family with a plot of ground could grow a great many potatoes on a small patch, and a meal of potatoes with a little salt, or a scrap of bacon, or a knob of dripping, filled hungry bellies at very little cost. For a great many poor families, the potato was quite simply the thing that kept them alive. Fact 26. And nowhere was this truer or more tragic than in Ireland, where the terrible dependence of the poor upon the single crop of the potato led, in the middle of the age, to one of the great catastrophes of the century. When a disease struck and rotted the potato crop in the ground, year after year, the food on which millions depended simply vanished, and a famine of appalling proportions followed, in which vast numbers died, or were driven to emigrate across the sea. It stands as one of history's starkest and most sorrowful lessons in what can happen when the food of a whole people rests too heavily on a single fragile crop. It is a heavy thing to sit with, that memory, the failure of one humble plant bringing such immense suffering, and it reminds us, gently and sadly, of how precious and how precarious the daily food of ordinary people has so often been. Fact 27. The baked potato, too, was a great food of the Victorian street. In the cold months, the baked potato seller was a familiar and welcome sight, with his portable oven glowing warm on the corner, selling hot potatoes to chilled passers-by. A hot baked potato, held in cold hands, cost very little and gave both a meal and a moment's warmth, one of the small mercies of the winter street, and a genuine comfort to the poor and the working people hurrying through the cold. Now let's think about vegetables and the garden, because the Victorians grew and ate a fine range of them, and here too the differences of class ran deep. Fact 28. Cabbage, onions, carrots, turnips, and other hardy vegetables were the everyday vegetables of the ordinary table, thrown into the pot to make the great boiled dinners and stews and broths that fed the family cheaply. Boiled, often for a very long time, in the manner of the age, these humble vegetables filled out the meal and stretched the precious meat, and a good pot of vegetable broth with a little bacon or a bone was honest, warming, everyday fare for a great many households. Fact 29. Many town dwellers, especially those who had come in from the countryside, kept an allotment or a garden plot where they grew their own vegetables, and this homegrown produce was a real help to the family budget and the family health. To grow one's own potatoes and cabbages and beans and peas was to have a little food security in an uncertain world, and the allotment became a cherished institution of the Victorian working man, a patch of green earth and quiet satisfaction amid the smoke and stone of the industrial town. Fact 30. Among the wealthy, meanwhile, the growing of vegetables and fruit reached the heights of an art. The great country houses had their walled kitchen gardens, their glass houses and hothouses, where skilled gardeners coaxed forth an astonishing range of produce, early peas and asparagus, delicate salads, and exotic fruits grown under glass. To serve a pineapple, grown at ruinous expense in one's own hothouse, or grapes and peaches out of their natural season, was to display wealth and mastery over nature itself. The kitchen garden of the great house was a place of real wonder and real extravagance. Fact 31. The pineapple, in particular, was the great glittering status fruit of the age. So costly and difficult to grow that it stood as the very emblem of luxury and hospitality. A pineapple set upon the table announced wealth and welcome in the most unmistakable way. They were so precious that they were sometimes not even eaten, but merely displayed, hired out for grand occasions, passed from table to table as a centerpiece, until at last, dearly, one was actually consumed. There is something wonderfully absurd and wonderfully human in that image. The same golden fruit carried in triumph from dinner to dinner, admired by all, eaten by none, until its final costly glory. Now let's turn to the great meal that stood at the very heart of the wealthy Victorian social world, the grand, elaborate, astonishing dinner. Fact 32. The dinner of the well-to-do Victorian was a thing of real spectacle and real seriousness, a long procession of many courses, served with ceremony that could stretch across hours of the evening. Soup, then fish, then a series of meat dishes, then game, then sweet puddings and savories and dessert, course after course after course, each with its proper wines and its proper etiquette. To dine well and to entertain well was one of the central duties and pleasures of the prosperous classes, and the dinner table was where much of the real business of society was conducted. Fact 33. For much of the age, the grand dinner was served in a style called service à la Française, where great numbers of dishes were set out upon the table all at once, in each course, in a glittering, symmetrical display, and the diners helped themselves and one another from whatever was within reach. The effect was one of sheer abundance and spectacle, a whole table groaning with food laid out at once. It was magnificent to behold, though it did mean that a dish out of one's reach might remain forever a mystery, and that much of the food grew cold upon the table. Fact 34. As the age wore on, this gave way increasingly to a newer style, service à la Russe, the Russian manner, where the dishes were carved and portioned at a sideboard and brought round to each guest in turn by the servants, course by orderly course. This is, in essence, the way a formal dinner is served to this day. It meant less spectacle upon the table, but hotter, fresher food and smoother service, and it meant, too, that a household needed a great many well-trained servants to carry it off, so that it became itself a subtle display of wealth. Fact 35. To fill the middle of the table, since the food was no longer heaped there, the new style gave rise to elaborate decorations and centerpieces, great arrangements of flowers and fruit, ornamental stands, and sculptural confections. The table itself became a work of art, dressed and decorated with enormous care. The whole grand dinner, indeed, was a kind of theater, a performance of wealth and taste and refinement, in which the food was only one part of a much larger and more dazzling show. Fact 36. Presiding over all this splendor in the kitchens below was the cook, and in the greatest houses, the cook was a person of real skill, real authority, and real importance. A talented cook, capable of producing the elaborate dishes the age demanded, was a valued and even a famous figure, and a great household competed to secure the best. Some of the celebrated cooks and chefs of the age, a number of them brought from France, became renowned names, the authors of grand cookbooks and the arbiters of fashionable taste. The kitchen of the great house was a place of intense, skilled, hierarchical labor, ruled over by the cook with something of the authority of a captain upon a ship. Fact 37. And ruling over the whole domestic world of food in the middle-class home was one book above all others, the great household manual, the most famous of which taught a generation of mistresses how to run their homes, manage their servants, and above all order and prepare their food. These vast volumes, packed with recipes and advice and household lore, were the Bibles of the respectable Victorian household, consulted daily, treasured, handed down from mother to daughter. To possess and to follow such a manual was itself a mark of the well-run, respectable home. Fact 38. This was, above all, the age of the servant, and the whole way that the comfortable classes ate depended utterly upon the labor of a whole hidden army of cooks, kitchen maids, scullery maids, and footmen. In even a modestly prosperous household, there would be at least a servant or two. In a great one, dozens. The mistress planned and ordered. The servants shopped, cooked, served, and cleaned. The gleaming, effortless-seeming abundance of the middle-class and upper-class table rested entirely upon the ceaseless, unseen, often exhausting work of these many servants, most of them young women, toiling long hours below stairs. Now let's spend a while with the sweet things, because the Victorians loved their puddings and cakes and sweets with a real and abiding passion. Fact 39. The pudding was one of the great glories of the Victorian table, and pudding meant a whole vast world of sweet, warm, comforting dishes to finish the meal. Steamed puddings, boiled puddings, baked puddings, suet puddings heavy with dried fruit, sponge puddings and milk puddings and fruit puddings. The range was enormous and the affection real. A good pudding to end the dinner was one of the true comforts of the age, warm and sweet and filling, and the making of a fine pudding was a point of real domestic pride. Fact 40. The greatest and most beloved of all was the Christmas pudding, that dark, rich, dense confection of dried fruit and suet and spice, boiled for hours in a cloth and carried in flaming with brandy to crown the Christmas feast. Rich with meaning as well as with fruit, the Christmas pudding gathered around it a whole cluster of customs. The stirring of the mixture by every member of the family, each making a wish. The little silver charms and coins hidden inside. The long weeks of maturing before the great day. It stood at the very heart of the Victorian Christmas, and much of the Christmas we still keep was shaped in exactly these years. Fact 41. And it was the Victorians, more than anyone, who made Christmas itself into the great warm festival of food and family that we know. The Christmas dinner, the roast turkey or goose, the pudding, the pies, the whole groaning abundance of it, took on in these years its cherished modern form. The image of the family gathered joyfully around a laden Christmas table, made famous by the great writers of the age, sank deep into the national heart, and the Victorian Christmas feast became a kind of ideal of warmth and plenty and togetherness that we reach for still. Fact 42. The roast goose was, for much of the age, the great bird of the Christmas table, especially for ordinary families, and many a poor household saved up all year, a few pennies at a time, in a goose club run by the local shop or pub, so that they too might have their bird at Christmas. Only later did the turkey, larger and grander, begin to take the goose's place at the center of the feast. But whether goose or turkey, the great roast bird carried into the Christmas table was the crowning glory of the whole year's eating for a great many families. Fact 43. Cakes, too, the Victorians made and loved in wonderful profusion, the great rich fruit cakes for weddings and Christmas, the seed cakes and sponge cakes and pound cakes, the little fancy cakes for the tea table. Baking a fine cake was a real accomplishment and a real labor, in an age before easy ovens and electric mixers, and a well-made cake was a source of genuine pride and a centerpiece of celebration. The Victorian tea table, spread with its cakes, and its bread and butter, and its little sandwiches, was a small monument to domestic skill and care. Fact 44. And this was the great age of sweets and confectionery for the children, of the sweet shop with its rows of glass jars, its boiled sweets and toffees and humbugs and barley sugar, its licorice and its lollipops. As sugar grew cheap, sweets came within reach even of poorer children, and a farthing's worth of sweets from the corner shop was one of the great joys of a Victorian childhood. The penny sweet, weighed out into a little paper twist, is one of the sweetest and most enduring small pleasures the age has left us. Now let's turn to the great new inventions and changes that were transforming, in these very years, what it was even possible to eat. For the Victorian age was, above all, an age of astonishing change in food, as in so much else. Fact 45. Perhaps the single greatest change of all was wrought by the railway. Before the railways, food could travel only slowly, and much of what a family ate had to be grown or produced nearby. The railways changed this utterly and forever, carrying fresh milk, fresh fish, fresh vegetables, and fresh meat swiftly from the country to the town, feeding the vast new cities and knitting the whole nation into a single great market for food. The railway did more than perhaps any other single thing to transform the Victorian table, especially for the town dweller. Fact 46. Fresh milk, in particular, was transformed by the railway. In the crowded early Victorian cities, fresh milk had been scarce, dear, and often dreadful, produced by cows kept in filthy conditions right in the town, and frequently watered down and adulterated besides. The railway made it possible to bring clean, fresh milk in from country farms each morning, and the railway milk that arrived daily in the great cities was a real improvement in the health and the diet of the townspeople, especially the children. Fact 47. Then there was the tin can, that humble, world-changing invention that let food be preserved and carried and stored as never before. Meat, fish, fruit, vegetables, milk, and much else could now be sealed in tins and kept for long periods, opening up whole new possibilities for the feeding of armies and navies and expeditions, and in time, of ordinary households. Tinned food was a genuine marvel of the age, and though it was regarded with some suspicion at first, it would go on to change forever the way the world ate. Fact 48. And in the latter part of the age came another marvel that transformed the meat trade utterly: refrigeration and the refrigerated ship. Suddenly it became possible to carry frozen and chilled meat across the oceans from the vast grazing lands of the Americas and Australia and New Zealand, all the way to the tables of Britain. This flood of cheap, imported meat brought meat within the reach of many poorer families for the first time, and marked a real improvement in the diet of the ordinary people in the closing decades of the age. Fact 49. Cheap imported wheat, too, came pouring in from the great new grain lands of America and beyond, carried by ship and rail, and it brought down the price of bread and flour for everyone. Bread, that great staff of life, grew cheaper and more plentiful, and the endless anxiety over the price of the loaf that had troubled the earlier age began at last to ease. The whole nation's daily bread was, by the century's end, cheaper and more secure than it had ever been. Fact 50. And so, across the long span of the age, the food of the ordinary people slowly but genuinely improved. The hungry, adulterated, precarious diet of the early Victorian poor gave way, by the century's end, to something more plentiful, more varied, cheaper and safer, more meat, more fresh food, cheaper bread and sugar, and laws at last to guard against the worst of the adulteration. It was a real and hard-won improvement, wrought by invention and by trade and by patient reform, and it meant that a poor family at the end of the age very often ate a good deal better than one at the beginning. Now let's turn to the shops and the markets, because the way the Victorians bought their food was itself changing dramatically, and the modern world of shopping was being born in these very years. Fact 51. Much of the food of the age was bought in the great bustling markets, and from the countless street sellers who thronged the towns, the costermongers with their barrows of fruit and vegetables and fish, crying their wares through the streets. The street seller was one of the great characters of the Victorian town, and the cries of the sellers, of hot pies, of fresh herrings, of cherries, of muffins, of watercress, filled the air of the city and formed a kind of ceaseless music of buying and selling that ran through the whole day. Fact 52. The muffin-man, ringing his bell through the streets with his tray of muffins and crumpets balanced upon his head, was one of the most beloved of these figures, especially in the afternoons and on winter days. Watercress, too, was famously sold through the streets, often by the very poorest children, gathered before dawn and hawked from door to door, a cheap green food that added a little freshness to the poor family's bread and butter, and a hard, cold way for a child to earn a few pennies. Fact 53. As the age went on, a new kind of shop began to rise, the grocer's shop, cleaner and more orderly, and in time the great grocery chains and the beginnings of the shops we would recognize today. Branded, packaged, standardized foods began to appear upon the shelves, biscuits in tins, tea in packets, cocoa in tins, and much else, with names that families came to know and trust. This was the beginning of the modern world of branded, packaged, advertised food, and it began in earnest in exactly these Victorian years. Fact 54. The Victorian biscuit, in particular, became a great commercial triumph, for biscuits could be made in factories, packed in tins, and shipped anywhere without spoiling, and the great biscuit makers of the age built famous fortunes and famous names. The tin of biscuits became a fixture of the respectable household, and the humble biscuit, in its endless varieties, was one of the great early triumphs of the new age of factory-made, branded, packaged food. Fact 55. Cocoa and chocolate, too, rose to new prominence in these years, and here a number of great Quaker families made their names, earnest, reforming families who promoted cocoa as a wholesome and temperate alternative to strong drink. Drinking cocoa became a cheerful, warming, respectable comfort, and by the age's end, the making of eating chocolate, too, was well underway, laying the foundations of the great chocolate industry and the beloved chocolate treats that were to come. Now let's think about drink, and about the great and troubled place that strong drink, and the fight against it, held in the Victorian world. Fact 56. Beer remained, throughout the age, a great everyday drink of the ordinary people, nourishing, cheering, and often safer than the water. Working people drank beer with their meals and after their labor, and the public house was one of the great social institutions of the working town, a warm and lively refuge from the cramped and cheerless home. Beer was woven deep into the fabric of ordinary Victorian life, for good and, as many came to feel, for ill. Fact 57. For strong drink, and above all cheap gin, cast a long dark shadow over the age, and the terrible toll it took upon the poor became one of the great social anguishes of the time. In the crowded, hopeless slums of the early Victorian city, cheap gin offered a swift and ruinous escape, and the misery of drunkenness, of wages drunk away and families ruined, was plain for all to see. The demon drink was, to many earnest Victorians, the very root of poverty and vice, and the fight against it became one of the great crusades of the age. Fact 58. And so there rose the great temperance movement, the mighty campaign to persuade people to drink less, or to give up strong drink altogether, and take the pledge of total abstinence. It was a huge and earnest and powerful movement, with its meetings and its societies and its processions, its coffee houses and cocoa houses set up as sober alternatives to the pub. Millions signed the pledge, and the cause of temperance became one of the defining moral crusades of the whole Victorian age, bound up with religion, with reform, and with the great struggle to better the lives of the poor. Fact 59. Out of this movement, in part, came a new fashion for soft drinks and non-alcoholic refreshment, for ginger beer, lemonade, and the various fizzy, mineral waters and cordials that were promoted as wholesome, temperate alternatives to strong drink. The bottling of fizzy soft drinks grew into a real industry in these years, and the ginger beer and lemonade of the Victorian age are the direct ancestors of the soft drinks we know. The temperance cause, whatever else it did, gave a real push to the making of cheerful, sober, bottled refreshment. Fact 60. Wine, meanwhile, remained the drink of the wealthy at their grand dinners, with its own elaborate rituals and its own procession of proper wines for each course, sherry with the soup, hock or claret with the fish, and the meat, champagne, port with the dessert. The knowledge and appreciation of fine wines was one of the marks of the cultivated gentleman, and the well-stocked cellar was a point of pride in the great house. Wine, like so much else, ran along the deep dividing line of class that shaped the whole Victorian table. Now let's return to the daily rhythm of meals, because the very shape of the Victorian day and the names and times of its meals was itself shifting and settling into forms we would half recognize. Fact 61. Breakfast for the comfortable Victorian family could be a substantial and even lavish affair, especially the great country house breakfast, with its array of dishes kept warm on the sideboard. Eggs and bacon, kidneys and kippers, cold meats, porridge, toast and marmalade, and much else might all be offered, and the diners helped themselves to whatever they fancied. The hearty English breakfast, that great institution, took much of its cherished form in exactly these Victorian years. Fact 62. Marmalade, in particular, became firmly established as the great breakfast preserve of the age, that bittersweet orange conserve spread upon the morning toast, which became so beloved a part of the British breakfast. made from the bitter Seville oranges, boiled up with sugar into a bright, tangy, glowing preserve, marmalade found its cherished place on the breakfast table in these years, and has never left it since. Fact 63. The great social change in the timing of meals was the steady drift of dinner, the main meal of the day, later and later into the evening among the fashionable classes. Where once dinner had been taken in the middle of the day, it moved across the age towards the evening, growing grander as it went. And this created a long, hungry gap in the afternoon, which was filled, as we have seen, by the new custom of afternoon tea, and a gap at midday, filled by the newer, lighter meal of luncheon. Fact 64. Luncheon, lunch, thus emerged in something like its modern form during these years, a lighter midday meal taken between the now early breakfast and the now late dinner. Among the leisured classes, it was often a modest affair, especially for the ladies of the house. Among working people, the midday meal remained more substantial, the dinner that fueled the working day. The very different meanings that dinner, tea, lunch, and supper still carry in different parts of Britain, and among different classes were being laid down in exactly these Victorian years. Fact 65. For the working family, the great meal of the day was very often the evening tea, that substantial meal taken when the day's labor was done, built around the teapot and whatever savory food the week allowed. Bread and butter, cheese, perhaps a bit of cold meat or fish, a relish or a pickle, and always the great comforting part of tea. This was the warm heart of the working family's day, the moment of gathering and rest and refreshment at the end of the long hours of toil. Now let's think more closely about the great and painful divide that ran through all of Victorian eating, the vast gulf between the tables of the rich and the poor. Fact 66. It is one of the defining truths of the age that, at the very same moment, and often on the very same street, there existed both some of the most lavish eating the world had ever seen, and some of the most desperate hunger. The groaning tables of the wealthy, with their endless courses and their exotic luxuries, stood in the sharpest imaginable contrast to the bare, anxious, often insufficient food of the laboring poor. This great and troubling contrast, plenty and want side by side, was one of the things that most struck and most troubled the more thoughtful people of the age. Fact 67. For the poorest of all, the very bottom of the great heap of Victorian society, food was a daily struggle and hunger a constant companion. The casual laborer, the sweated worker, the widow, the old, the sick, and the unlucky lived always on the edge of not having enough, and in bad times fell over that edge into real starvation. The thin diet of bread and tea and scraps that sustained the poorest was a diet of bare survival, and the fear of the workhouse, where the destitute were fed and housed under harsh and shaming conditions, hung over the whole world of the poor. Fact 68. The workhouse itself, that grim institution, was designed to provide food and shelter to the destitute in conditions deliberately made hard and unappealing, so that only the truly desperate would enter. The workhouse diet was plain, monotonous, and meager in the extreme: bread, gruel, a little cheese, thin soup, small measured portions, and it became a byword for cheerless, grudging, institutional food. The famous image of the workhouse child asking for a little more has come down to us as one of the great emblems of Victorian hunger and Victorian hard-heartedness. Fact 69. Gruel, that thin porridge of oatmeal and water, was the very symbol of the food of poverty and the institution. Thin, watery, barely nourishing, but cheap and warming and better than nothing at all. It was fed to the poor in the workhouses, to the sick, to prisoners, and to the destitute, and its very name came to stand for the meanest and thinnest of fare. Behind that thin grey bowl of gruel lay the whole hard reality of Victorian poverty. Fact 70. And yet, as the age wore on, a great many earnest and kind-hearted people worked to feed the hungry and better the lot of the poor, through soup kitchens and charities, through the giving of food to the destitute, through school meals for hungry children, and through the slow, patient work of reform. The Victorian conscience, stirred by the terrible contrasts of the age, gave rise to a vast effort of charity and reform around food and hunger, and though it could not cure the deep problem of poverty, it eased real suffering, and it planted seeds that would grow, in time, into greater things. Now let's follow the food out across the wider world, because the Victorians ruled a vast empire, and their table both fed it and was fed by it in turn. Fact 71. The great empire, spread across the whole globe, poured new foods and flavors onto the Victorian table and drew British foodways out across the world in return. Tea from India and China, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from the East, coffee and cocoa from the tropics, wheat and meat from the temperate colonies. The empire was, among so many other things, a vast machine for moving food around the world, and the Victorian table sat at the very center of it. Fact 72. Above all, the empire in India brought the flavors of Indian cooking home to Britain, and the Victorians developed a real and lasting love of curry. Curry powder appeared on grocers' shelves and in household cookbooks. Curry dishes became a fixture of the middle-class table, and the taste for the spiced foods of India sank deep roots in the British diet that have flourished ever since. That great and enduring British love of curry, still so strong today, was born in exactly these Victorian years. Fact 73. One famous breakfast dish, kedgeree, a comforting mixture of rice, flaked fish, and egg, gently spiced, came home from India to become a beloved part of the Victorian breakfast table, especially in the country house. It is a perfect small emblem of the way the foods of the empire flowed back into the heart of British eating, mingling the flavors of far-off India with the homely fish and rice and egg of the British kitchen. Fact 74. Tea itself was drawn ever more from the great new tea plantations of India and Ceylon, which rose up in these years to rival, and then surpass the old tea trade with China. The strong, dark Indian teas came to suit the British taste, drunk strong with milk and sugar, and the great tea estates of the empire fed the ceaseless national thirst. The very cup of tea at the heart of the Victorian home was, by the age's end, an imperial product, grown far away and carried home across the seas. Fact 75. And British foods and foodways travelled outward too, carried by settlers and soldiers and administrators to every corner of the empire, the roast dinner served in the tropical heat, the attempt to keep up the customs of home in far-off lands, the Christmas pudding eaten under a summer sun on the far side of the world. Wherever the Victorians went, they carried their table with them, and something of the Victorian way of eating was planted across the whole wide world, to grow and change and endure in 100 new homes. Now let's turn to how the Victorians thought about their food, for this was an age much taken with ideas of health, of morality, and of the proper ordering of everything, food included. Fact 76. The Victorians were greatly concerned with health and diet, and a whole world of advice, much of it earnest and some of it very strange, grew up around what one ought to eat for the good of body and soul. There were prophets of plain living and prophets of particular foods, advocates of vegetarianism and of special health regimes, and endless counsel in the household manuals about wholesome eating and proper digestion. The link between food, health, and even morality was taken very seriously indeed. Fact 77. It was in these years, too, that the vegetarian movement took real shape and gained its very name, a movement of people who, for reasons of health or ethics or religion, chose to abstain from meat. Vegetarian societies were founded, vegetarian restaurants opened, and vegetarian cookbooks written, and though it remained the choice of a minority, the modern vegetarian movement was truly born in exactly these Victorian years, driven by a real and earnest conviction. Fact 78. There was a strong strain of moral seriousness about food and drink running through the age, a sense that how one ate reflected one's character, that gluttony and drunkenness were real vices, and that plain, wholesome, temperate eating was a kind of virtue. This earnest, improving, sometimes stern attitude to food sat alongside the age's real love of good eating in an interesting tension, and it shaped much of the advice and the anxiety that surrounded the Victorian table. Fact 79. And this was the great age of the cookbook and the household manual, for the rising middle classes, anxious to do everything correctly, hungered for guidance on how to cook, how to entertain, how to run a proper, respectable home. The cookbooks and manuals of the age poured forth in their thousands, teaching a whole class how to eat and to serve in the correct and respectable manner. To own the right books and to follow their counsel was itself a mark of the aspiring, respectable Victorian household. Fact 80. Cleanliness and purity in food became, as the age went on, a growing and powerful concern, driven partly by the terrible scandals of adulteration and partly by the new understanding of germs and disease. The slow, hard fight to clean up the nation's food, to stop the adulteration, to ensure clean milk and pure water, to bring in laws and inspectors to guard the food supply, was one of the great quiet achievements of the later Victorian age, and it saved a great many lives, especially among the children of the poor. Now let's gather up a few more small treasures, a handful of last glimpses into the food world of the Victorians. Fact 81. Ice, before the days of the refrigerated ship and the domestic refrigerator, was itself a considerable trade and a considerable luxury, great blocks of it cut from frozen lakes, or later manufactured, and stored in ice houses, and sold to the wealthy for cooling their food and making their ices. The ice cream and the water ice were great treats of the age, sold from barrows in the streets as well as served in the grand houses, and the penny lick of ice cream was one of the small delights of the Victorian town, for all that it was often far from clean. Fact 82. Jelly, gleaming and warbling and brightly coloured, was one of the great showpieces of the Victorian table, especially at children's parties and grand dinners alike. Made with real skill from calves' feet, or later from packaged gelatine, moulded into fantastical shapes, and set glittering upon the table, the jelly was a small triumph of the confectioner's and the cook's art, and a source of real delight, especially to children. Fact 83. Custard, that smooth, sweet sauce of eggs and milk, was the great companion to the Victorian pudding, poured warm over the pies and the tarts and the steamed puddings, and much beloved. Late in the age, a clever powdered custard was invented that could be made without eggs, cheaply and easily, and it brought this small comfort within reach of every household. The pudding and its custard remain, to this day, one of the cosiest of all the inheritances of the Victorian table. Fact 84. The Victorians were great makers and eaters of pickles, relishes, and bottled sauces, sharp, tangy, savoury things to enliven the plain, cold meats and the everyday food. A great many famous bottled sauces and relishes and pickles that we know today were created in exactly these years, born of the age's love of a savoury relish and its genius for factory-made, bottled, branded food. The bottle of brown sauce, the jar of pickle, the dash of a piquant sauce upon the plate, these small savoury pleasures are a real Victorian legacy. Fact 85. Eggs were a valued and versatile food across all classes, boiled, fried, poached, and scrambled, baked into countless dishes, and used in vast quantities in the great age of baking and pudding making. The hen's egg was a small, nourishing, everyday treasure, and the keeping of a few hens in the yard, where there was room, gave many a household a welcome supply of fresh eggs and a little independence from the shops. Fact 86. And porridge, that ancient dish, remained a great and warming breakfast food, especially in Scotland and the north, and among those who valued a cheap and wholesome start to the day. A bowl of hot oatmeal porridge, with a little milk or salt, filled the belly and warmed the body against the cold morning at very little cost, and it fed a great many Victorians, rich and poor alike, as they set out into the day. There is a deep and simple comfort in a bowl of hot porridge on a cold morning that the Victorians knew as well as anyone. Now let's think for a moment about the sheer labour that lay behind the Victorian meal. For here, as in every age, an enormous amount of quiet, unregarded work stood behind every plate of food. Fact 87. Cooking in the Victorian home was hard and heavy and skilled work, done without any of the easy conveniences we now take for granted. The great iron range had to be blacked and cleaned and stoked, and its temperamental heat mastered. Water had to be carried and heated. Food had to be prepared by hand, plucked and gutted and pounded and beaten and stirred, with no machines to help. To cook a family's food, day after day, was a labor of real effort and real skill, and it filled a great part of the waking hours of a great many women and servant girls. Fact 88. Below stairs in the great houses, the kitchen maids and scullery maids toiled at the hardest and lowest of this work, the endless scrubbing of pots and pans and floors, the plucking and scaling and scouring, the fetching and carrying, the rising before dawn and the working late into the night. Theirs was a hard and hidden life of ceaseless labor, and the effortless seeming splendor of the master's table rested squarely upon their tired young shoulders. It is right and good to remember them, these unregarded girls, whose work fed the age and whose names are mostly lost. Fact 89. And in the poor home, it was the mother, above all, who bore the vast burden of feeding the family, sharping with her few precious coins, stretching the meager food to go round, cooking on a wretched little grate or a shared kitchen fire, going without herself so that her husband and her children might eat. The heroism of the poor Victorian mother, working small miracles of thrift and love to keep her family fed through hard times, is one of the quiet, unsung glories of the whole age, and it deserves to be remembered with real tenderness and real respect. Fact 90. Thrift, indeed, the making of a very little go a very long way, was one of the great domestic arts and virtues of the age, prized and preached and practiced, above all by the women who ran the homes. Nothing was wasted that could be saved. Every scrap and bone and rind was put to use. The household manuals were full of counsel on how to use up leftovers and stretch the food and waste not a farthing. In a world of narrow margins, this patient, skillful thrift was not a nicety but a necessity, and it was practiced with real ingenuity and real pride. Now, before we begin to draw near the end of our journey, let's gather up a few final threads and reflect a little on the whole great sweep of what we've seen. Fact 91. It's worth remembering just how much the Victorian table changed across the long decades of the age. For the woman setting out the tea at the century's end lived in a quite different food world from her grandmother at its beginning. Cheaper food, more varied food, safer food, food carried by rail and ship from across the world, new inventions and new shops and new customs. The transformation was profound. To have lived through the whole age was to have watched the everyday meal remade almost entirely. Fact 92. And so much of the food we think of as timelessly traditional was, in truth, shaped or born in these very years. The fish and chips, the afternoon tea, the great Christmas dinner and its pudding, the marmalade at breakfast, the love of curry, the bottled sauces, the branded biscuits and cocoa. So many of the cherished, familiar tastes of British eating were made, or made popular, or given their lasting form in exactly the Victorian age. When we sit down to these things today, we are, in a real sense, still at the Victorian table. Fact 93. We know so much about all this because the Victorians wrote it down in a great flood of detail such as no earlier age had left. Their cookbooks and household manuals, their diaries and letters and account books, their newspapers and their great social surveys of how the poor really lived, all of it survives in wonderful abundance, so that we can reconstruct the Victorian table, high and low, in a richness of detail that would be impossible for almost any earlier time. Those earnest social investigators who went out to record exactly what the poor ate, meal by meal and penny by penny, have left us an especially precious and moving record. Fact 94. The great writers of the age, too, filled their pages with food, with groaning Christmas tables and thin workhouse gruel, with cozy teas and grand dinners, and the pinched meals of the poor. Food runs all through the literature of the age, as a way of showing character and class and fortune, of conjuring warmth and comfort or want and misery. Through these vivid pages, the Victorian table comes down to us alive and glowing, in all its plenty and all its hunger. Fact 95. And the Victorians, for all their earnestness and all their hardship, plainly took real and deep pleasure in their food, in the warmth of the tea table, the glory of the Christmas feast, the comfort of the pudding, the treat of the sweet shop, the cheer of the well-laid dinner. Beneath the class divides, and the moral seriousness and the real suffering of the poor, there ran a genuine and human love of good food and good cheer, of gathering around the table with one's own, that is entirely recognizable to us still. Fact 96. It was an age, above all, of contrasts held together in a single world, of the tin can and the hothouse pineapple, of the workhouse gruel and the 12-course dinner, of the hungry watercress child and the languid duchess at her afternoon tea, all alive at once, all part of the same great changing story. To understand the Victorian table is to hold all of this together at once. The plenty and the want, the invention and the tradition, the hardship and the warmth. Fact 97. The great trend of the age, for all its terrible inequalities, was towards improvement, towards more food, cheaper food, safer food, for more and more people. The bettering of the ordinary people's diet across the Victorian age was real and hard one, achieved through invention and trade and the patient labor of reform. And by the centuries end the poor, though still poor, very often ate more and better than their grandparents ever had. It was a slow and imperfect improvement, but it was a genuine one, and it points the way toward the better-fed world that was still to come. Fact 98. Yet the shadow of hunger never quite lifted from the age, and we should not let the warmth of the tea table make us forget the thin bowl of gruel, or the child asking for more, or the mother going without. The Victorian abundance was real, but so was the Victorian hunger, and the two lived side by side to the very end. To remember the age honestly and kindly is to remember both, the plenty and the want together, and the ceaseless human effort in every home high and low, simply to be fed. Fact 99. For beneath every difference of class and fortune, the same simple human needs and pleasures ran through every Victorian home. The comfort of a hot drink at the end of a cold day. The gathering of the family around the table. The small treat that lifted the spirits. The anxious care of a parent to see the children fed. The warmth and the fellowship of a meal shared with those we love. These things joined the Duchess and the labourer's wife across all the vast gulf that divided them, exactly as they join us to the Victorians still. And so we come, at last, to our 100th and final fact, the one that gathers up the whole long thread of this journey and ties it gently together. Fact 100. For all the differences we've travelled through tonight, the workhouse gruel and the 12-course dinner, the penny sweet and the hothouse pineapple, the poor family's bread and tea, and the great lady's afternoon of delicate cakes, there was, in the end, one quiet and enduring truth that ran beneath every Victorian table. It was the same truth that runs beneath every table in every age, that people must eat every day, and that in the eating, and above all in the sharing of it, there lies something warm and deep and profoundly human. From the grandest dining room glittering with silver and candlelight to the poorest kitchen with its single pot upon the range, the Victorian age was, quietly and fundamentally and always, an age of people gathering, as best they could and with what they had, around the table, and finding there, in the food and the drink and the company, a measure of warmth and comfort against the dark. So there it is, 100 small facts, gathered slowly from the kitchens and the parlors, the great houses and the crowded streets of a world both near to us and strangely far. And what have we truly found, in among all that gaslight and grandeur and grime? Not just an age of top hats and empire and stern-faced worthies. Instead, we found families gathering around the teapot at the end of a long day's work. We found tired servant girls toiling below stairs to conjure up the splendor above. We found poor mothers working small miracles of thrift and love to keep their children fed. We found the muffin-man ringing his bell through the winter streets, and the baked potato seller glowing warm on the corner, and the sweet shop with its rows of gleaming jars. We found the great Christmas pudding carried in flaming to a roomful of cheers, and the humble bread and jam that gladdened a poor child's heart. And we found, running through all of it, that same deep human love of a good meal and a warm drink, and the company of one's own around the table that we know so well ourselves. That, in the end, is what the grand and busy image of the Victorians so often hides. Not just factories and empire and progress, but people, ordinary people, working with real care and real ingenuity to feed themselves and one another, in a world that was changing faster than any before it. It's easy, so very easy, to picture the age only as a parade of great events and famous names. But if you look a little closer at something as simple and as ordinary and as deeply human as a shared pot of tea, or a slice of bread and jam, or a family drawing close around the fire at the day's end, you find something warmer glowing there all along. You find people who loved a good meal and a warm cup and the company of their own by the fire, exactly as we do. So the next time you sit down to eat, whatever's on your plate, whatever's in your cup, you might spare a gentle thought for all of them. For the mother stretching a few coins to feed her family. For the servant girl scrubbing pots in the pre-dawn dark. For the child clutching a farthing's worth of sweets. For the poor man with his bread and cheese, and the rich one at his glittering dinner, and the whole vast, crowded world of them, high and low, gathered around their tables against the cold. 100 and more years gone now, all of them, and yet joined to us still by the oldest and simplest thread there is, the daily human need to eat, and the quiet, warm pleasure of sharing it. Thank you for wandering through it all with me tonight. There's nothing more to do now, and nowhere else to be. Let the fire burn low, let the long evening close softly in, and let yourself drift, gently and easily, down into a deep and peaceful sleep. Rest well, sleep gently, good night.